Fandom tourist is a term that has recently gained a large amount of traction in a variety of fandom spaces.
Yeah, no, they changed the term. It's actually called larping now. Yeah.
Fandom LARPing is a term that has recently gained a large amount of traction in a variety of fandom spaces, usually in a derogatory manner. A quote-unquote fandom LARPer is deemed someone who claims to be a fan of a specific piece of media without actually properly engaging with said media. Now, it is quite common for certain fan bases to get a large boost in popularity, usually as a result of newer, more easily accessible entries in the franchise. In some cases, however, stranger circumstances allow for these popularity boosts, such as another fandom gaining interest in a much more niche series. An example of this would be when a bunch of Homestuck fans migrated to the fandom for the game Off during one of the comic's infamous hiatuses. But regardless of whatever the reason may be for a fandom to have a sudden spike in notoriety, it is common for the older fans to become protective and start gatekeeping their beloved series, believing that fans who join these fandoms during these spikes are not genuine fans who care about the story, and instead are just hopping on a bandwagon. Oftentimes, older fans will decry newer fans as normies, fake fans, or even LARPers. Admittedly, this has been a talking point in fandom spaces for a long time now, especially as fandom culture has evolved and nerdy properties such as Marvel have become some of the most important pieces of recent pop culture. But today, I want to analyze a few notable examples of this phenomenon and see if this issue is actually that deep. I also have a few friends to help me out. Let's begin. Now, one of the most extreme examples that I personally have experienced of fandom gatekeeping caused by an influx of new fans is with the fandoms for Pico School, Spooky Month, and Madness Combat. The main thing these three fandoms have in common outside of being tied to Newgrounds is that their spikes in popularity around 2020 to 2021 lies with the game Friday Night Funkin'. Friday Night Funkin' quickly became a major figure in the world of indie gaming, gaining a large fan base very suddenly. And notably, characters from Pico School and Spooky Month appear as opponents in the game, while Madness Combat was a popular subject for early fan-made mods. These factors caused many people to check out these series for the first time after learning about them from Friday Night Funkin', and then becoming new fans themselves. And many older members of these fandoms, especially the Pico School fandom, were not happy about this. Largely because there was a consistent trend of people referring to characters like Pico and Tricky as being characters from Friday Night Funkin', a statement which is obviously false. However, many of these younger fans did genuinely enjoy these series on their own merits removed from the context of Friday Night Funkin'. I myself happen to have gotten into all three of these properties because I learned about them from Friday Night Funkin'. In fact, during 2021, Madness Combat actually eclipsed my Friday Night Funkin' fixation, instead becoming my main hyperfixation for 6 months straight. But I suppose to a degree it makes sense as to why older fans would be annoyed by this sudden influx of younger kids unaware of these characters' histories. Part of what makes Newgrounds so fascinating in the wider history of indie creations as well as the history of the internet is the fact that Newgrounds has one of the most unique user bases a social platform can have. Newgrounds as a website and a community puts a lot of value on its legacy, its anniversaries. It has a whole culture of celebrating the people who have left an undeniable impact on the site, such as Crinkle, Senior Palo, and Tom Fulp. Because Newgrounds is a hub specifically for artists by artists, the people who regularly use Newgrounds are people who really care about the community and how much it has impacted indie animation and gaming. So, to see a bunch of kids unknowingly spreading false statements about these characters and their origins, yeah, I can understand how that would be annoying. However, I should also add that because Newgrounds as a website tends to be pretty separated from a lot of average social media expectations, there were a handful of people freaking out about these newer fans in a less justified way. Specifically in the case of Pico, there were a lot of fans who were just kind of blatantly homophobic, complaining about newer fans quote-unquote ruining the character by shipping him with Boyfriend from Friday Night Funkin'. Now, while this did lead to Tom Fulp and Ninja Muffin taking the funniest possible action in response, it is still just obviously annoying to see, because shipping is inevitable for any fandom. That is just a fact at this point. This homophobia also extended to Madness Combat once that series also gained a sudden massive boost in attention around mid-2021 with the Tricky Mod update. And from what I remember, this homophobia on both ends eventually died down, or at least quieted down. But I figured it was worth bringing up in the context of Newgrounds-related gatekeeping. While Newgrounds is often perceived as a relic of the 2000s internet, and much of its reputation even today is based on that fact, I think this story serves as an example of how fan bases are always going to evolve and change. No one expected Friday Night Funkin' to become so instantly beloved it breached such a niche, but it did, and now it has cemented itself as a key part of Newgrounds' history. It drew in a whole new crowd of people to experience an underappreciated cornerstone of internet history for the first time. And despite the fact that characters like Pico and Tricky have existed for over 20 years now, I think it's kind of beautiful that they are still able to inspire the newer generations. Also, it's probably for the best that Newgrounds got that free advertising from Friday Night Funkin', because let's be real, there's not a lot of good places to post art online these days. Now, to talk about a more popular piece of media, Mario. Now, the Mario fandom is actually kind of in a weird spot when discussing quote-unquote large fandoms. Mario is obviously one of the biggest icons in all of pop culture, yet the actual fandom is a bit more niche. There are some pieces of media that are so popular most people tend to absorb the general basics through cultural osmosis, but likely have only engaged with the media on a surface level. So, as a result, the amount of people partaking in typical fandom practices like shipping or writing fanfiction is actually a lot smaller than you would expect. Mario is one of these franchises. While most people have probably played a Mario game before, most likely Mario Kart or Mario Party, let's be honest, the amount of people writing earnest fanfiction is actually a lot more slim. This is why I think a lot of the more dedicated Mario fans on Tumblr, for example, tend to also really enjoy the RPG games like Paper Mario, because these games have much more story and character-related content to chew on. So you would think a whole movie of content would be perfect for more dedicated fans. Well... Now, my personal stance on the Mario movies is that they are alright. I acknowledge fundamentally they do not really work if you have no interest in Mario, but I enjoy them. However, the Mario movies ended up creating a whole subsection of the fandom dedicated to them. A subsection that actually ended up drawing in a lot more typical fandom activity like fanfiction and shipping. We will talk about Boiji another day. However, I have seen quite a divide in Mario fans versus Mario movie fans. The Mario movies pre-release actually brought up a lot of anxiety amongst the fans for quite a few reasons. The celebrity casting, specifically Chris Pratt as Mario and to a lesser extent Seth Rogen as Donkey Kong, the involvement of Illumination, a studio with quite a mixed reputation, the more generic characterizations of the cast, and so on. While I do find the movies enjoyable, I also must acknowledge the fact that they are a bit generic. I mean, Mario is admittedly a franchise known for its formulas, but I don't think the movies offer much new that the rest of the franchise wouldn't be able to offer. Perhaps the reason Mario movie fanfiction is so popular is because people find it easier to write Mario and Luigi when they have discernible speech patterns in this canon. Or maybe it's because the movie accidentally fueled the one ship I actively dislike and am refusing to elaborate on further because I want to stay focused on the video topic. Whatever the reason, the movies are quite an interesting subject for debate in the fandom. I wouldn't say I see much gatekeeping for Mario, but what I do see is frustration. Frustration that many people who only focus on the movie don't really understand what makes these characters really special, only focusing on a surface-level depiction. Frustration in the way the movie was very clearly made to cater to kids in a generically Hollywood way, thus the movie is designed to make these characters as marketable as possible. Frustration that many people are so focused on these movies when the wider Mario franchise has so much more to discuss, and with the recent release of the sequel, spoilers for the sequel incoming, skip ahead if you don't want to hear that, frustration regarding the lore. I have seen a lot of hardcore fans frustrated towards the rewrites of Rosalina's story, not just because it's completely different from Mario Galaxy's backstory, but because it made Rosalina and Peach sisters. A change that made the pre-movie existence of Rosalina and Peach as a ship really awkward. And I had a whole segment about how this continuity is different from the game's continuity, only for Miyamoto to randomly announce that this backstory is retroactively canon now, so thanks for that! While this case of fandom LARPing is far from the most intense, I figured it was worth including because it serves as an example of how an origin point for a fan can in some ways have an impact on the fandom experience and certain character depictions. Like how people keep infantilizing Luigi and making him out to be like a scared little
Okay,
twink,
well,
like,
we're just gonna move over here and they can finish their many thoughts on that matter. Oh. Do you guys want to hear about Limbus Company? Limbus Company is the third game in the Project Moon series, and is undoubtedly the most popular of the three. And I can see why. It's free, the characters are really charming, and it's the least confusing of the three when you start out. Due to all these factors and an evil secret third thing, Limbus Company has garnered its own individual fandom that's separated from the rest of the series. This doesn't mean the other two games aren't acknowledged. For a lot of the world building, you would have needed to at least seen the other two, though Limbus is the one that most people actively play and talk about. For the longest time, I thought that the gatekeeping outrage from Limbus is a bit silly, because, like, it's a new free gacha game, of course new people are gonna show up, dude, that's the whole point. But it was much less of an issue back then. That is, until early 2025 when the Roblox game Forsaken was getting popular. And as much as that game is in a absolutely horrendous state right now, at the time, it was good. One of the main draws of the game was the music and the skins that would be overt references to other pieces of media. You had Ultra Kill, you had Celeste, and most obviously Limbus Company. At the time of the game's release, only one of these skins was available, being Gas Harpoon John Doe, based on Ahab, who is the boss of Canto 5. This skin was by far the highest effort skin for John Doe at the time, custom voice lines, visual effects, and most importantly for this specific video, a Last Man Standing theme. Last Man Standing, or LMS, was when, well, there was one survivor remaining. This would cut down the time and play a specific music track, but for Gas Harpoon specifically, it would play a remix version of Compass, which is the song that plays when you fight her in Canto 5. And because that song is a fucking masterpiece, a lot of people went searching for the franchise that the skin came from, which brought a large influx of new fans. Obviously, because fandom is the way that it is, these new fans were subject to a lot of critique, especially since the game that is most popular is the latest one in the franchise, so a lot of focus was put on whether or not you had played or experienced the previous games. Project Moon references in Roblox games wasn't anything new, and had been a quote-unquote issue for a good while, but Forsaken's popularity was leagues above any attention the games had ever received, and for the most part, this reaction is unwarranted. Well, that was until a few months later. Another skin that was relentlessly teased came out for the character 1x1x1x1, or just 1x because that's a mouthful. This skin was known as Hacklord, and was based on the L King from Canto 6, and oh my god, no one shuts up about the L King anymore. With the original influx, it was actually just an overreaction on the part of the fandom, since people were wanting to actually get into the games, but Christ, this second wave was so much worse. Every single comment section would have the same people going, "How wild," with the same damn image of L King every single time. It was nearly as bad as the 2018 JoJo fandom, which is a big accomplishment, if you can even call it that. And since the plague of LARPers has haunted the Project Moon community ever since, far enough that on the hell site of Twitter, Project Moon fans have started their own PM LARP games based on a similar event within the Jujutsu Kaisen fandom. The whole point of the games is to say the most incorrect, irrelevant, or ignorant thing about Project Moon, and get the tweet popular with the hashtag. Or if you saw this as a funny one-off gag, some people are still posting LARP game tweets to this very day. I was gonna have a bit about a specific account here, and then they deleted it like a few days before this like script recording happened, so I can't really do that anymore, so that's unfortunate.
Speaking of unfunny repeated fandom gags, Resident Evil is arguably the most popular franchise in the survival horror genre, especially considering it coined the name, with a laundry list of games, movies, etc. The series itself is known for a variety of key aspects, like a focus on tense, nightmarish atmospheres and limited resources leading to stressful moments of critical thinking, and for something with so much stark contrast and tone across entries, you would naturally attract a large number of fans with an appreciation for different parts of the bigger picture. But the thing that really interests me, and the topic of this video, is how the visually striking nature of both sides of this franchise and the increasing popularity of each new release draws in people who don't have access to, or just choose not to play the games themselves. This is especially prevalent at the moment, considering Resident Evil Requiem, the 9th mainline game in the franchise, released earlier this year as the series' best-selling title by far, putting its world at the forefront of the modern gaming sphere and, in extension, increasing the interest of the franchise. Of course, there will always be people who will want to talk about the new thing just because it's the new thing, which leads us to posts like this. For context, Carlos has an entire multi-hour section in Resident Evil 3 Remake, a game with zero story DLC. This isn't really what I'm talking about, though. This is your generic engagement bait. It's how Twitter users communicate in the wild. This is the habitat they've adapted to. However, it is still a very clear phenomenon that people have been pretending to be Resident Evil fans recently in order to feel included in the hype of a new game releasing, and the term Fandom LARPer has been thrown around about as many times as Leon has. And speaking of Leon, one of the visually striking aspects that led to such a widespread gravitation to this franchise would be the traditionally attractive characters that play key roles throughout every game, leading to shippers and cosplayers taking interest to characters like Leon and Ada due to their appearances and aesthetics rather than their roles in the actual story. I went to a convention recently, and essentially the only Resident Evil trinkets I found were pinups of Leon Kennedy, which, I mean, fair, but... Now, unlike Fizz, I'm not an expert in the anthropological nature of fandom culture and history, nor am I a Fujoshi, but character ships have been a staple in the key elements that increase a media's popularity in fandom spaces since the dawn of storytelling, back when the first caveman thought maybe those two figures in the cave paintings Thok made could get along. However, I do know about how horror stories have this draw to them that hooks the curiosity in those who wouldn't ordinarily engage with this sort of media with its implications and presentations of terror, because my younger sister sends me Five Nights at Freddy's Roblox game clips. Resident Evil as a horror franchise is so deceptively simple, as the daunting number of games masks the fact that practically all of them can be enjoyed as standalone projects, which A, creates the sense of accessibility for people to latch onto one particular character or aspect of one of the titles while not engaging with the rest, and 2, make the horrors the characters survive in question very easy to comprehend, with most of them either being personally connected to the protagonist or some otherwise literal monstrosity that acts as an obstacle to overcome. This accessibility can lead to surface-level engagement with both the characters and the world of Resident Evil, opening a gateway with people who enjoy the aesthetics of horror without truly delving into the actual complexities in story or gameplay, either due to a lack of interest or a lack of ability, stemming from not having the technology to play them or the bravery to fully dive into the horrific elements. Additionally, the genre of Resident Evil leads to intentionally methodical or sometimes frustrating gameplay roadblocks like backtracking or scarce resources that keep people who hate those kinds of mechanics in games from actually playing them, which, again, fair. In the end, this leads to a divide in the fandom. People who actively engage with the source material as intended, and people who absorb the information from it through outside sources. I don't think the latter is inherently worse, though. I've played Resident Evil games, but not all of them, and I still hold a ton of respect and reverence for many titles I haven't gotten around to because of the word of mouth from friends or others online, and playthroughs I've watched myself. I can't say I love a game I haven't played, but that's because of the way I personally engage with media. One is able to appreciate the character work, OSTs, visual design, and more about a game without actually playing it, because those are aspects that can be viewed from an outside perspective. I'd argue a problem only arises once entitlement is introduced into the fray, with fights about what makes a true fan of a piece of media, and if you're getting involved with those kinds of arguments, then I will simply assume that you have just recently hit the double digits of age, and happy birthday! Not to say it's not a bit of an issue when people talk about the Resident Evil games and lore without actually knowing what they're talking about, but I think the disdain for these kind of people is genuinely pretty harsh at this point. Engaging with media is important, and if you pretend to know about and be a fan of something without actually caring to check out the thing you're talking about in question, you're being very purposefully ignorant, especially considering how Resident Evil is such a monumental piece of horror game history and has had massive impacts that reverberate into games that are coming out to this very day. I understand that the gameplay isn't your thing, but being honest about that will net you far more respect than lying. However, on the other hand, this recent uprising of fandom LARPers has led to the increased ridiculing and gatekeeping of the franchise itself, which in turn leads to more scrutiny on what creates a true fan of the franchise, and I think at this point, you should just drop it, because it really is not that serious. If you're that concerned about not being able to talk about people about Resident Evil because all of them are tourists pretending to play the game, then you're also probably the kind of person who's bothered by the fact that the notification in the screenshot is unchecked, and to that I say that you should probably reevaluate how much the action of others personally affect you. In conclusion, Resident Evil is a very multifaceted franchise that invites people from numerous demographics to check out the horrors, and as someone who decided to fully look into what it has to offer after being introduced via the Paul W.S. Anderson films, which are great by the way, and you're not going to fight me on this, it's very interesting to see how the quote-unquote epidemic of fandom LARPers can really just boil down to people not willing to engage with either the media or new people who have taken an interest in it. And I have used engage 7 times now in my segment of this video, which is why I don't write scripts. And after that I wrote like a little... I have a thumbs... Sorry, I bumped the microphone. I have a thumbs up emoji in the script, and I don't know how I expected myself to... like, vocalize that? Go watch Zach Kreger's Resident Evil in theaters September 18th, the movie designed to make true fans and LARPers very upset, and me, the happiest clam this side of the sea. Pause! I wrote this before the trailer came out. I have more to say. Sorry. Zach Kreger's Resident Evil, releasing this upcoming September, doesn't focus on any one particular game, instead opting to capture the feeling of the franchise as a whole through a reinterpretation of the Raccoon City incident following a new character fighting new bioweapons. While I understand being disappointed by the fact that it's not an adaptation of the characters and settings that have played a massive part in the franchise's popularity, it's so interesting to see what people consider to be the essence of Resident Evil, and how people are lying again. I mean, I get it, right? Seeing someone take up the mantle of a franchise like this just to put their entire new spin on it is very scary. But at the same time, I feel like people are complaining about aspects that have just been part of the Resident Evil franchise since its inception. Before, it was just people arguing over games that have already released, but it's genuinely fascinating to see what people consider to be the bones of this franchise, and by extension, what they remember of the games themselves, especially those who have not played them and are LARPers, but even people who have played them. Gatekeeping has been amplified at this point with how fans are referring to anyone, new school gamer or old school gamer or retro gamer or ancient gamer fan, as being a fake fan for insinuating that this new take could be accurate in capturing the vibe and feel of the games. And for those who don't actually know much about the games and are just trying to hop on the bandwagon, it's even more obvious. Of course, it's completely fine to be disappointed or even hate this new interpretation. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but trying to imply your opinion in question is absolute is the type of thing that the villains in this franchise say. With that being said, the Paul W.S. Anderson movies are the best, and if you disagree with me, then you will not survive the winter. Okay, bye!
But with all those examples out of the way, I think we should now talk about one of the most interesting examples of fandom LARPing, and possibly the worst one. I say it might be the worst one because it was so bad it affected the actual writer's room. I am talking about My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. Now, the history of the My Little Pony fandom, specifically the Generation 4 fandom, is objectively a fascinating topic. There is so much you could analyze regarding the way this fandom still influences internet culture, the way the fans latched onto every background character, the shipping culture, everything. But part of what made this fandom so unique was the existence and prominence of bronies. Bronies being adult male fans of the show. What no one knew at that point in history was that the culture of bronies would heavily influence the show and certain characterizations in the upcoming seasons. Certain background characters got their personalities and names from the brony fandom. To some degree, this may not seem like a bad thing. At the time, it was much rarer for the writers of shows to be so close to their fandoms, so this was seen as cool and revolutionary. But it's no secret that the brony fandom had a darker side to it. My Little Pony did have a fan base before Friendship is Magic, but it was a much smaller, female-centric fandom focused on collecting the toys. And infamously, the brony fandom began on 4chan. I don't think I need to explain how these are two very different demographics. This situation with the case of fandom LARPing is honestly much more complex. The brony fandom started ironically, then became genuine over time, a factor that makes this example much more nuanced. Friendship is Magic is an interesting case study of the contradictory nature of ironic enjoyment, and I think that irony heavily impacted how many of these newer fans interacted with the older fans. These people were actual fans of the show and the characters, while also completely mocking the franchise's history and core demographic. Now, of course, not every brony was like this, but the more vocal ones were. But when Hasbro also started catering to these fans, both in the show and in the merchandise designs, yeah, that's pretty annoying. Honestly, the nature of bronies is a situation that requires its own video, but in the context of this subject, I do think it is worth bringing up. While Friendship is Magic is quite unlike the previous generations, I do think it is weird to be a fan of a franchise while demeaning what came before, and also, you have to remember that the show came out at a very important time for internet fandoms. The 2010s was the time when social media fandom culture as we know it really started to take off. Because of that, there were many people who felt like their niche safe havens of nerddom were suddenly becoming overrun. There are many examples of this being the case in peak 2010s fandoms, and Friendship is Magic did start in 2011. I think there is an argument to be made that LARPing accusations are an evolution of the 2010s fake fan accusations. This has always been a concern in fandom spaces, and when you have examples of quote-unquote newer fans coming in and metaphorically trashing the place in the case of My Little Pony, this fear seems a bit more reasonable, right? Well, I don't know. I feel like there are so many complicated factors surrounding this specific case. I also do think some of the blame should go to Hasbro for changing the toy designs and incorporating references to cater to bronies, a move that I can only imagine emboldens certain brazen bronies. While these people were undoubtedly fans of the show, I think the real issue at play was the blatant misogyny and complete disregard for the safety of child fans, especially considering children were the main demographic. Sure, they cared about the characters like a true fan would, however they showed no care for the other fans who were there from the beginning, which is funny because the show literally is about friendship. But I also think the initial irony poisoning of the brony beginnings is a key element here, because so many of these fans treated their enjoyment as a joke, the sudden boom in popularity being based in irony. It heavily affected how they perceived the fandom. I think part of what makes fandom LARPing an issue nowadays is that some people perceive being in certain fandoms as like a special badge of honor rather than a community, and I definitely think that was the case for bronies. Especially considering so many fandom in-jokes at the time were explicitly brony in-jokes. A lot can be said about the nature of the brony fandom and how it impacted the franchise's legacy, and while this example isn't entirely comparable to the LARP discourse of Twitter today, I still wanted to bring it up as an example of the hypothetical worst-case scenario. I should also probably wrap up the segment soon because unfortunately this topic is way too interesting to me. While all these situations have varying degrees of intensity, I think there is some common ground we can analyze regarding the nature of this gatekeeping. This gatekeeping is tied to a deep love for these franchises, which may sound incredibly obvious when I say it, but it is worth acknowledging that in modern days, fandoms can often be heavily tied to a person's identity online. Certain artists are known for specific fandoms, for example. Fandoms are now seen as exclusive clubs and not a community. And I understand that when you have such an intense passion for a piece of media, for the characters, for the story, for the world, it can be frustrating to see people treat it as a trend, a fad, something that's just cool in the moment. I can sympathize with this experience. It is certainly annoying. In my own experience, I have seen people who straight up harassed me for liking certain media, later engaging with that media once it became trendy. It is annoying as hell. But ultimately, at the end of the day, fandom LARPers are not that big a deal. While it can be incredibly aggravating to see, oftentimes the hatred for LARPers can be even more tiresome than the LARPers themselves. At worst, this attitude could even discourage potential fans from joining the fandom. I'm not trying to imply that there are never any examples of people engaging with certain fandoms for the sake of clout or pretending to be fans, but ask yourself this. Is it really worth it to get so heated over a handful of random fans who aren't even actual fans? I think as long as a quote-unquote LARPer shows actual interest in engaging with a story and related media, there really is no cause for concern. If you suspect someone is a LARPer, wouldn't it be better to help them further engage with the fandom in question? And if they are only into the piece of media because it's trendy, well, they'll likely leave the fandom when it's no longer trendy. No harm, no foul. I honestly think a major issue with modern fandoms is that many feel as if they have to engage with every fan they come across, and if a handful of fans are incorrect about whatever, they are a stain on the whole fandom, which is just not true. They can play with toys in their own corner, and you can play in your corner. While I sympathize with the mindset behind gatekeeping, I don't think there is any reason to let that mindset ruin your ability to welcome new fans. Hypothetically, if these new fans are causing issues in the fandom, that's a case-by-case basis. And ultimately, where's the fun in closing off your love and passion for something? Fandom is more fun when that earnest passion is on full display, after all. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it to the end, like, comment, subscribe, do all the YouTuber stuff. And I want to give a massive shout out to my friends Try and Nat for helping me out with these segments. Specifically the Limbus Company segment and the Resident Evil segment. You guys are awesome. Love you very much. Thank you once again. And yeah,